The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields of Jacob's ancestral land. The air was thick with the scent of freshly tilled soil, a reminder of the countless generations who had worked this land with their bare hands. For Jacob, this was more than just dirt and crops. It was his family's legacy, a history of resilience passed down through the generations. Every inch of this land held memories of his father, his grandfather, and every ancestor before them who had fought for this place. Jacob stood at the edge of the field, his weathered hands gripping the rusted fence that separated the land from the road. He could hear the faint hum of engines in the distance, growing louder by the second. It wasn't just the sound of passing cars. It was the sound of a battle coming to his doorstep. As the dust kicked up from the dirt road, a black SUV appeared on the horizon. It slowed to a stop in front of Jacob's gate, and the doors swung open. 3 men stepped out, all dressed in expensive suits, their expressions cold and dismissive. They weren't from around here. Jacob had seen their kind before, corporate men sent to acquire land, to push people like him out. They carried the air of entitlement, as though the world existed for their convenience. One of them, a tall man with slicked-back hair and a smug grin, held a thick envelope in his hand. Jacob's heart sank. He knew what it meant. He'd seen it before. Land developers coming in, using their money and influence to take what wasn't theirs. They had done it to others in the area, pushing out the old families that had lived there for generations. But he never thought they would come for him. The tall man walked up to Jacob, his shoes crunching on the gravel as he moved. Jacob stood firm, refusing to back down. "You Jacob Turner?" the man asked, his voice smooth but laced with arrogance. "I'm Jacob," he replied, his voice steady despite the growing anxiety in his chest. He already knew what was coming. The man didn't waste time with pleasantries. He held out the envelope with a deliberate, almost mocking motion. "This is an eviction notice," he said coldly. "The land you're farming is unfit for use. We've done our research. Your family's financial instability has made it impossible for you to maintain it. This land will be sold to a development company. You've got 30 days to vacate." Jacob's eyes widened. The words felt like a punch to the gut. "Unfit for farming?" he repeated, his voice trembling with disbelief. "This land has been passed down through my family for over a century. My father worked this land, my grandfather before him. It's not unfit. It's a part of us." The man's smirk only deepened. "It's not about what you want, Jacob. It's about what's best for the future. This land is valuable. And it's time you realized you never really deserved it in the first place." The words hit Jacob like a slap. His chest tightened with anger, but there was an emptiness in the pit of his stomach. He had fought his whole life to keep this land, but now it seemed that no matter how hard he tried, it wasn't enough. "You can't do this," Jacob protested, his voice growing louder. "This is my family's land. You can't just take it." The man raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "You don't have a choice, Jacob. We have the law on our side. You'll be out of here in 30 days, or we'll make it sooner." Jacob's heart raced. His mind screamed at him to fight back, but the truth was clear. The power of the law, the weight of money and influence, it was all against him. As the man turned to leave, he paused and glanced over his shoulder, his words hanging in the air like a final blow. "You never deserved it in the first place," he said, before walking back to his SUV. Jacob stood frozen, his body trembling with a mix of rage and helplessness. The injustice was too much to bear. This wasn't just about land. It was about his family's dignity, his father's legacy, and everything his ancestors had fought for. The developers had taken more than just his land. They had taken his pride, his hope, and his future. But Jacob wasn't ready to let them win. Not yet. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the fields as Jacob's father, James Turner, stepped outside their small farmhouse. He had always been an early riser, just like his father before him and his father's father. It was a Turner tradition, a testament to the hard work that had been passed down through generations. Jacob watched from the porch as his father bent down to touch the earth, his fingers brushing the soil as if seeking a deeper connection. "Son, this land, it's more than just dirt and crops," James had told him one day, his voice full of a quiet strength. "This land is our history. It's the blood, sweat, and tears of our people. Don't you ever forget that." Jacob had been just a boy then, but the words had stuck with him. He watched his father work tirelessly, day in and day out, to keep their farm running. It wasn't just about making a living. It was about surviving in a world that was designed to keep black people like them from succeeding. There were fewer black families in the area, and the ones who were there had to fight every single day against prejudice, violence, and injustice. But the Turners had been resilient. They had fought for this land, scraped by with every obstacle in their way, and somehow managed to thrive in a place that didn't want them. Flashbacks painted a vivid picture of Jacob's ancestors. His great-grandfather, who had bought the land with hard-earned savings after working as a sharecropper, and his grandfather, who had stood up to a local white landowner trying to steal their property. Each generation had a story of struggle, of standing up against the system that sought to erase their presence. But each generation also knew that the land was their foundation, their connection to their roots, their legacy. Jacob's mind raced back to the day he had lost his father. The cancer had taken him quickly, stealing away the man who had been his rock, his guide, and the one person who believed in the value of their land more than anything. Jacob had promised his father he would carry on the fight, that he would protect their family's legacy. But now, standing in the shadow of the land developers, Jacob felt his promise slipping through his fingers. The land wasn't just a piece of property. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for. And now it was being taken from him, just like it had been taken from so many others. Jacob's heart twisted with pain as he thought about the generations who had worked this soil, who had lived and died for it, only to have it snatched away by people who would never understand what it meant. Jacob's mother had been a pillar of strength, but she had grown quiet in recent years. The weight of their financial struggles, the mounting pressure from the racism they had to endure, had taken its toll on her. Jacob could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the silent resignation. She had always supported him, but now even she seemed unsure of how to face this latest challenge. "You're going to fight them, right?" she had asked him just days before the eviction notice arrived, her voice tinged with a quiet fear. "You're going to fight for us?" Jacob had nodded, even though the doubt lingered in his mind. He knew the odds were stacked against him. He knew the law, the system. Everything was rigged in favor of the wealthy, the powerful, the ones who could afford to bulldoze families like his. But what choice did he have? To let them take the land, to give up the fight, would mean letting down everything his ancestors had worked for. He could already hear the voices of his father and grandfather echoing in his mind. "This land is ours. It's our fight." Jacob spent sleepless nights researching, trying to find any loophole, any legal recourse that could stop the eviction. He reached out to local lawyers, but their faces told him what he already feared. No one wanted to take his case. The developers were too powerful, the legal system too corrupt. Every lawyer he contacted turned him away, citing conflict of interest or lack of resources. It was clear that the system wasn't built for people like Jacob. It was built to protect those who had the money, the connections, and the influence to make problems disappear. But Jacob wasn't giving up. He couldn't. He knew that if he walked away now, he would be betraying everything he had worked for, everything his family had fought for. So he turned to an old friend, Rachel, a lawyer who had grown up in the same small town. Rachel had always been an ally, someone who had stood by his side when they were kids, playing in the dirt, dreaming of a better future. Now Rachel was an experienced civil rights lawyer, fighting cases of racial discrimination and injustice. She had seen it all, the way the system crushed the black community, the way the law was often nothing more than a tool for the rich to keep the oppressed in their place. "I can't promise you anything, Jacob," Rachel had warned him when he walked into her office. "The system is designed to protect people like them. But if you want to fight, we'll fight together." Her words gave him a glimmer of hope, but it wasn't enough to silence the doubt gnawing at the back of his mind. Jacob knew they were up against more than just a corporate land development company. They were up against a system that had always devalued black lives, a system that would do anything to ensure that people like Jacob never had a place in the world. The battle was bigger than just this land. It was a fight for his family's legacy, for the dignity of his ancestors, for the future of his community. The courtroom was cold, its silence suffocating, as Jacob sat at the defendant's table, staring at the floor. His mind raced with the words of his lawyer, Rachel, who had warned him that this fight wouldn't be easy. The courtroom, filled with indifferent faces, felt like a battleground where the outcome was already decided before they even began. The judge, a stern man with a permanent scowl, looked down at Jacob from his elevated seat, as if peering down from a perch of power. The opposing lawyers were dressed in crisp, expensive suits, their faces sharp with the arrogance of those who believed they had already won. These were the representatives of the corporate land development company, the ones who had come to take Jacob's family's land, and they were playing the game with all the advantages. Jacob's heart sank as the proceedings began. The lawyer for the land developers, a man named Stephen Carmichael, stood up first, his voice smooth and dripping with condescension as he addressed the court. "We're not here to fight for land," Carmichael began, his eyes glancing briefly at Jacob. "We're here to ensure that the rightful owners of this land can move forward without the burden of this property. Mr. Turner and his family before him have proven incapable of maintaining it." The audience could feel the weight of his words, a statement that not only questioned Jacob's ability to run the land, but also stripped away the pride and history of the Turner family, reducing them to mere failures in the eyes of the law. Jacob clenched his fists beneath the table, his knuckles white with the force. The sting of the injustice was unbearable. His mind flashed back to the late nights spent working the land with his father, to the pride he had felt when he had learned how much his ancestors had sacrificed to keep it. This wasn't just about land. It was about dignity, heritage, and survival. Rachel stood up to present their side of the case, her voice calm but firm, contrasting with the storm raging inside Jacob. "Your Honor, we are not here to dispute ownership. What we are here to do is fight against a system that seeks to erase a history that has been in place for over a century. The Turner family has worked this land for generations, and they've earned the right to continue doing so." But Jacob could see that the jury, if they were even listening, was indifferent. Their eyes were glazed over, focused more on the paperwork and formalities than on the human element of the case. It was as if the story of a black family's struggle for survival and justice meant little to them. The judge barely reacted, his expression unreadable as he glanced over the case files. Jacob could sense the bias that ran through the veins of the courtroom, the subtle but unmistakable disregard for his family's history. The system wasn't built for people like Jacob. It was built to favor those with money, power, and influence. As the trial dragged on, the days in court felt like months. Every argument Jacob and Rachel presented was met with a counterattack from Carmichael and the judge's impartiality. The fight was becoming exhausting. Jacob could feel the weight of the years bearing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for land anymore. He was fighting for his family's legacy. But with each passing day, the odds seemed stacked higher and higher. It was during a routine check of old documents that Rachel uncovered something that would change the course of the trial. One evening, after a particularly brutal day in court, Rachel sat hunched over a stack of papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jacob sat across from her, barely able to keep his eyes open, the fatigue wearing him down. "I've been going through the Turner family's records," Rachel said, her voice suddenly sharp with realization. "Something's off." Jacob leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Rachel pulled out a series of documents from an old land deal, an agreement from decades ago signed in the early 1900s when Jacob's great-grandfather had first acquired the land. There were discrepancies in the signatures, and some of the dates didn't align with the historical records they had. It was subtle at first, just an odd feeling, but as she dug deeper, it became clear that the land had been wrongfully taken from Jacob's ancestors long before the developers came into the picture. The land deal was fraudulent. Jacob's family had been tricked, swindled out of their rightful inheritance. They had never truly owned the land in the eyes of the law. Instead, it had been illegally transferred to a corporation under false pretenses. His ancestors had fought for their land, only to have it stolen from them decades ago in a carefully orchestrated move designed to push black families out of the area. Jacob's chest tightened as the weight of the discovery hit him. His family's struggles, the fights, the sacrifices, it had all been for nothing. The land had been stolen from them long before they even realized it. The injustice wasn't just happening now. It had been happening for generations. "This is huge," Jacob whispered, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "They've been stealing from us for years." Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "We have to use this. This changes everything. If we can prove this fraud, it'll give us the leverage we need." But even as they prepared to expose this new evidence, a shadow loomed over them. Just days before they were set to present the new discovery in court, a mysterious figure appeared in Jacob's life. Marcus was a man of few words, but his presence was magnetic. He showed up at Jacob's door one evening, claiming to know something crucial about the true culprits behind the land theft. He seemed to have inside information, but Jacob wasn't sure if he could trust him. "I've been watching this case closely," Marcus said in a low, gravelly voice. "I know who's behind all of this. The developers are just pawns. It's bigger than that. There's someone pulling the strings from the shadows." Jacob's instincts told him to be wary, but the desperation for answers outweighed his caution. Marcus promised to provide the information Jacob needed to expose the true perpetrators. But as he left, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had his own hidden agenda. Could he be trusted? Or was he just another piece of the puzzle, someone trying to manipulate Jacob's fight for his own gain? As the trial continued, Jacob's uncertainty grew. Marcus's appearance had added a new layer of mystery to an already complicated case, but it was also clear that this discovery would be a game-changer. The battle was far from over, and now Jacob was faced with even more questions than before. Who could he trust? And how far would the corruption run? Jacob's world had become a blur of courtrooms, threats, and sleepless nights. He was so close to exposing the corruption and reclaiming his family's land. But just when things seemed to be falling into place, a storm brewed that threatened to unravel everything. It started with Marcus. Jacob had believed, naively perhaps, that Marcus was a man of integrity, a whistleblower who had risked everything to expose the dark underbelly of the land developers' schemes. Marcus had come to him, offering the missing pieces of the puzzle, the evidence that could prove the fraud and get Jacob's family's land back. He had been Jacob's secret weapon, his last hope in the fight for justice. But that hope was shattered when Rachel received an anonymous tip. It came in the form of a letter, postmarked from an unfamiliar location. When she opened it, her face turned pale, and Jacob's heart dropped. The letter contained details about Marcus's involvement with the land developers, information so precise, so damning, that it left no room for doubt. Marcus wasn't just a bystander in the fight against injustice. He had been working with the developers all along. Rachel handed Jacob the letter, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Jacob, I'm so sorry, but it's true. Marcus is one of them. He's been feeding them information." Jacob's mind raced as the weight of the betrayal hit him. He had trusted Marcus. He had believed that the man had genuinely wanted to help him, to take down the very people who had stolen everything from his family. But now it felt as though his entire world had collapsed around him. His ally had been a wolf in sheep's clothing, feeding the enemy from within. Yet, as the shock subsided, something strange happened. The anger that had first risen in Jacob's chest slowly transformed into something colder, something more calculated. Marcus wasn't just a traitor. He was a man riddled with guilt. And when Jacob confronted him, it became clear that the betrayal ran deeper than Jacob could have imagined. "I never meant for it to go this far," Marcus admitted, his voice filled with regret. "I thought I could get out before it went too far, but they had me, threatened my family. I didn't have a choice. I never thought you would get this far." Jacob stared at him, his eyes burning with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "You're telling me you've been working with them all along? While I've been fighting for my family, you've been feeding them information, helping them steal our land?" Marcus dropped his head, ashamed, unable to meet Jacob's gaze. "I know what I've done, and I can't undo it, but I'm trying to help now. I've seen what they're capable of, what they've done to you. I can't keep working for them. I'm here to make things right." Jacob's chest tightened, but the fire of betrayal was already burning away, replaced by a cold resolve. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What are you offering me, now that I know the truth?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I have evidence, documents that link the developers to fraudulent land deals, deals that have been hidden for years. You'll be able to prove they stole your land, not just from you, but from your ancestors. It's the final piece of the puzzle." Jacob's mind raced as he processed what Marcus was saying. This was it, the missing piece, the key to unlocking the truth. But the cost of the evidence was steep. Marcus had betrayed him. He had worked against him for so long, and now Jacob had to decide whether or not he could trust the man who had put everything at risk. "Where is it?" Jacob demanded. Marcus hesitated for a moment before he nodded. "I'll give it to you, but you have to promise me something. You have to promise me that you'll use it to stop them. You can't let them win." Jacob's jaw clenched. "I'll stop them. I'll make sure they never get away with this." As the two men parted ways, Jacob felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and determination. Marcus may have sold him out, but he had also handed Jacob the weapon he needed to expose the truth. Now Jacob had to decide what to do with the information and how to ensure that the developers would never be able to erase his family's legacy. Jacob's resolve was put to the test as the days wore on. The land developers, sensing that Jacob was closing in on their secrets, began to turn up the pressure. They made it clear that they would stop at nothing to intimidate him into dropping the case. One evening, Jacob returned home to find his house vandalized. Windows were smashed and graffiti was scrawled across the walls, racial slurs, hateful messages meant to break his spirit. It felt like a personal attack, a reminder of the lengths the developers were willing to go to in order to drive him out. His heart pounded as he surveyed the damage, his fists clenched in fury. But the anger didn't last long. Instead, a fierce determination began to rise inside him. He couldn't back down, not now, not when he was so close to the truth. The threats escalated. Late one night, Jacob was attacked on his way home. A group of masked men jumped him from behind, pushing him to the ground. They beat him relentlessly, shouting at him to drop the case, warning him to stay out of their business. But Jacob wouldn't be intimidated. He fought back with every ounce of strength he had. With a final burst of energy, he managed to break free, running for his life. Bruised, bloodied, and shaking, he limped home. But even as his body ached, his resolve only grew stronger. He had a purpose now. He was fighting not just for his family's land, but for justice, justice that had been denied to his ancestors for far too long. The emotional climax came one fateful night when Jacob decided to confront the developers directly. No more hiding, no more running. If they wanted a fight, he would give it to them. He stood on the steps of the developers' headquarters, his eyes steely with determination. As the door opened, Jacob stepped inside, not waiting for permission. "You think you can erase us?" Jacob's voice echoed in the cold, sterile room. "But you can't. This land is my father's, and his father's before him. You'll never erase us, no matter how hard you try." The developers, who had once looked at him with disdain, now saw something different in his eyes, something fierce, something unyielding. Jacob wasn't just a man fighting for his land anymore. He was a man fighting for his family's dignity, for their legacy, and for the countless others who had suffered at the hands of people like them. As the developers stood silent, Jacob turned and walked out, knowing that this battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that victory was within his grasp. The morning sun broke through the windows of Jacob's modest home, casting a pale light over the room. It was a new day, but it felt like the culmination of everything Jacob had endured, the final stage in a battle that had pushed him to his limits, mentally and physically. His body was battered, bruised, but his spirit remained unbroken. He sat in front of his computer, the evidence Marcus had given him spread out in front of him like a weapon. With every click, every page he turned, Jacob could feel the weight of the history behind the documents. His ancestors, who had fought for this land, now had their names cleared, their sacrifices honored. What had once seemed impossible was now a tangible, undeniable truth. The developers had underestimated him. They had thought they could break him, bend him to their will. But Jacob was more than just a man fighting for land. He was fighting for his heritage, for the dignity of his family, and for every black family that had suffered at the hands of corruption and greed. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It had become a fight for justice, for those who could not fight back. With shaking hands, Jacob clicked send, and the information went public. His family's story was about to be heard by the world. The evidence he had uncovered, documents proving that the land developers had used fraudulent land deals to steal not just his family's property, but the property of countless others, was now in the hands of investigative journalists, legal experts, and social justice advocates. As the story spread across the media, Jacob's fight became a national cause. News outlets picked up the story, and within days, the public outcry was deafening. People rallied behind Jacob, sending messages of support, demanding justice, and calling for a full investigation into the developers' ties to local politicians who had turned a blind eye to the thefts. For Jacob, it was overwhelming. The pressure, the attention, it all felt like a storm that had come to a boiling point. But he couldn't stop now, not when everything was finally in motion. The developers had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. The day of the final showdown arrived. Jacob stood outside the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been here before, in smaller, less significant battles, fighting against eviction notices, fighting to keep his family's farm running, fighting to hold on to a piece of land that had been the heart of his family for generations. But this was different. This wasn't just a legal fight. It was a battle for his family's legacy, for the generations who had come before him and the ones who would come after. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. The developers, once so confident in their power, were now facing a room full of reporters, activists, and community members who had come to witness the final moments of their downfall. Jacob's lawyer, a fierce woman named Linda, stood by his side, ready to take on the corrupt system that had allowed these developers to operate with impunity for so long. As the court proceedings began, Jacob could feel the eyes of the entire room on him. His palms were sweaty, his mind racing, but he remained calm. The time for emotion had passed. This was about justice, and justice had a way of cutting through the noise. The courtroom fell silent as Linda presented the evidence, a stack of documents that laid out the fraud, the corruption, and the developers' direct involvement in a series of illegal land deals. The once powerful land developers, sitting in their expensive suits, squirmed in their seats as the weight of their crimes became undeniable. One by one, Linda dismantled their defense, exposing the lies, the bribery, and the manipulation they had used to steal Jacob's land and countless others. Every lie they had told, every attempt to twist the truth was laid bare for the world to see. It was a fight Jacob had been waiting for his whole life, one that could bring not just personal redemption, but the chance to change the course of history. The judge, a seasoned man who had remained neutral up until this point, finally stood. He turned to the developers, his voice filled with authority. "You have been found guilty of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Your actions have caused irreparable harm to this community, and the truth has finally come to light." A collective gasp spread through the courtroom as the judge ordered the developers to return all the stolen land to its rightful owners. Jacob's heart swelled with emotion. He had won. He had done what seemed impossible. His family's land, his father's land, was his once again. But even as Jacob stood in the courtroom, a quiet satisfaction settled over him. The weight of the victory felt bittersweet. The fight had cost him so much. He had lost his peace, his sense of security. His family had been torn apart by the threats, the violence, the constant pressure to give up. His body still bore the marks of the struggles. The developers had tried to destroy him, but in the end, they had failed. As he walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, Jacob couldn't help but reflect on the cost of this victory. Yes, he had reclaimed his land, but the emotional toll was undeniable. He had sacrificed so much along the way, his sense of safety, his comfort, his peace of mind. And yet, as he looked out at the faces of those who had rallied behind him, he knew it had been worth it. Jacob had won, not just for himself, but for every black person who had fought against the systems of injustice, for every family that had been denied their rights, for every life that had been lost to greed and corruption. This victory was a testament to the power of perseverance, the strength of community, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The developers were out. Their empire crumbled. They would never again hold the power they once had. And Jacob? He had reclaimed more than just his land. He had reclaimed his dignity, his legacy, and his place in history. And no one, not even the richest, most powerful men in the world, could take that from him. Jacob stood tall, looking at the land that stretched out before him, knowing that he had won the fight of his life. He wasn't just a man standing on his ancestors' land. He was a symbol of the unbreakable spirit of his family, and the resilience of every oppressed soul who had ever fought for justice. This land, once taken from him, would now be a living testament to the fight for what was right. And as the sun set over the horizon, Jacob knew that he had not only reclaimed his father's land, he had reclaimed the future for his children and for generations to come. Jacob stood silently at the edge of the land, his fingers brushing over the soil that had been the heart of his family for generations. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. This was it, the moment he had fought for, the moment when his family's land was finally returned to him. The victory was his, but the weight of the journey, the sacrifices, and the emotional cost hung heavy in the air. He took a deep breath, letting the fresh, earthy scent of the land fill his lungs. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. There was peace here. The land, once stolen, now felt like home again. The memories of his father, of his grandfather, of the family who had fought so hard to keep this place alive, flooded back to him. It was a bittersweet victory. The legal battle, the threats, the violence, it had all taken its toll. He had lost so much in the fight for this land. But now it was his. Jacob closed his eyes for a brief moment, taking in the quiet beauty of the place that had been at the center of his family's legacy for generations. The pain, the struggles, they all seemed to fade into the background as he stood there, holding the land he had won back. The fight had been long, the enemies were ruthless, but Jacob had prevailed. Yet as he stood there, a sense of unease crept in. His mind flickered back to the threats, the forces that had worked so hard to strip him of this land. He knew that while this victory was significant, it was far from the end of the story. The fight against systemic injustice, against the people who thought they could take everything from him, was still ongoing. Jacob turned away from the field, making his way toward the small house where his family waited. His children, his wife, the people who had supported him through this relentless battle. He couldn't wait to sit down with them, to finally experience the peace they had all lost. The court battle was over, but there was still so much to heal. As he approached the front door, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Jacob pulled it out, his fingers trembling as he looked at the unknown number flashing on the screen. He swiped to answer, and before he could speak, a voice, a low, gravelly tone, spoke through the receiver. "You've won this battle, Jacob," the voice said, "but the war isn't over." Jacob froze, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The voice was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His mind raced, trying to piece together who this could be. His victory had come at a high price, but now, it seemed, it was only the beginning of something darker, something more insidious. "What do you want?" Jacob's voice was steady, though his mind was reeling. He didn't know who this was or what they were after, but one thing was clear. The people he had fought were not going to let him go so easily. The voice on the other end of the line chuckled darkly. "You think the land developers were your only enemies? No, Jacob. There are others, ones with even more power. They won't stop. They'll never stop until everything you've built is gone, and we know where to find you." The line went dead. Jacob stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and determination. He could feel the weight of the threat, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He had thought that by winning the case he had finally secured his family's future. But now, it seemed, there was more to come, forces far bigger and more dangerous than the developers. As he turned toward the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The fight for his family's legacy, for justice, for the future of every black family who had suffered from the same forces, was far from finished, and Jacob knew deep down that the next battle was already beginning. He walked into the house, his family waiting for him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had won today, but the fight for justice, true justice, was still ahead, and he would face it head on, no matter what. But as the door closed behind him, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The shadowy figure who had warned him spoke words that rang in his ears. "The war isn't over.